Now that we've got our basic getBooks method working, let's add a few more detailed endpoints to make our book repository more powerful and complete. These methods will allow us to get a specific book by its ID, get a book by its title, retrieve a book's rating, and check if a specific book exists in the database. Let's open our iBook repository interface and add the following methods. Here's what each one does. GetBook returns a single book that matches a specific ID. GetBook with string title returns a book using its title. GetBook rating with book ID retrieves the average rating for that book. We'll implement this logic soon. Book exists checks if a book exists in the database, returning true or false. By adding these to the interface, we're defining the contract for our repository, which means that every class implementing this interface must include these methods and their logic. In the next step, we'll move over to the book repository class and implement these methods to make them actually work with the database. Now that we've added our method definitions inside the interface, it's time to implement them in the book repository class. Let's start with the getBook method. This method will return a single book from the database where the book's ID matches the parameter we pass in. Inside our book repository file, let's add the following implementation. Here's what's happening. We're using LINK to filter our books table and find the book where the ID equals the value we received from the request. The first or default method will return the first match, or null if no book with that ID exists. This is a clean and efficient way to query data using Entity Framework Core. Now, let's go ahead and finish implementing the rest of our methods in the repository. First, for getting a book by title, we'll do almost the same thing as before. Filter by the title and return the first match. Next, let's add a method to check if a book exists by ID. And finally, a method to get a book's rating. Here, we'll use the reviews to calculate the average rating for a specific book. Now that our repository is ready, let's talk about something really important before we start building our API endpoints. DTO, which stands for Data Transfer Objects. Anytime we build an API endpoint, it's a good practice not to return our database models directly. Instead, we use DTO. Simple objects that define exactly what data we want to send or receive through our API. This helps us in three ways. It protects our internal database structure. Clients only see the fields we choose to expose. It keeps our responses lightweight and clean, without unnecessary data. It gives us flexibility. We can change the database model later without breaking the API contract with our clients. So, inside our project, let's create a new folder called DTO. This folder will contain all the data transfer objects for our app, things like Book DTO, Author DTO, Review DTO, and so on. In the next step, we'll create our first DTO for books and start using it in our controller responses. Now let's add another HTTP GET endpoint inside our book controller, this time to retrieve a single book by its ID. We'll define a new action called getBook, which takes the book ID as a parameter. We'll also specify our response types, a 200 response that returns a single book object if everything goes well, and a 400 response if something goes wrong. For example, if the book doesn't exist. This gives our API a clean and predictable way to fetch individual books by their unique identifiers. Now, let's add another endpoint that will return the rating of a specific book. We'll define a new HTTP GET route called bookid/rating. This action will first check if the book exists, and if it does, it will fetch and return the rating value. We'll specify a 200 response type of decimal, since the rating might be something like 4.5, and a 400 response type if the book ID isn't valid. This endpoint is useful when we want to display the average rating of a book without fetching all the review details. All right, now it's time to test our API. Let's go ahead and run the application. This will start our web API locally and host it on a development server. Once it's running, we can open the and send a GET request to our endpoint at API Books to make sure everything is working correctly. If everything is set up properly, we should see our list of books returned in JSON format. That means our controller, repository, and database connection are all working together perfectly. Now, let's test our next endpoint, getting a single book by its ID. In the browser, I'll change the request URL to APIBooks1 and keep the method as GET. Then I'll hit send. If the book with ID 1 exists, we should see all its details displayed as a JSON object, including the title, author, and any other properties defined in our model. This confirms that our root parameter is working correctly and that our controller can handle individual book lookups by ID. And that's it for today's video. We've successfully built and tested our book review API, from setting up the models and controllers, all the way to running it and testing our endpoints in Postman. If you found this helpful, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part, where we'll start adding more endpoints and connect this API to a real front end. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.